What if I told you that somewhere in the hills of southern France, there exists a city designed not for the living, but for the dead? A place where every street, every building, every carefully planned corner was created with one purpose: to house those who would never walk its pathways. And what if I told you that the man who spent 23 years of his life creating this architectural marvel disappeared the moment it was completed, leaving behind only his shadow wandering through the empty streets? This is the story of Henry Beaumont, a brilliant architect who became so obsessed with death that he built an entire necropolis, and then chose to become its only living resident. But, as you'll soon discover, the line between living and dead became dangerously thin in his city of eternal rest. Henry Beaumont was born in 1867 in Lyon, France, the son of a successful marble sculptor who specialized in funeral monuments. From childhood, Henry was surrounded by death. His father's workshop was filled with weeping angels, grieving widows carved in stone, and elaborate mausoleums destined for the wealthy departed. While other children played with toys, Henry played among marble tombstones, treating cemetery angels as his companions. Perhaps it was this early exposure, or perhaps it was something darker. But Henry developed an unusual fascination with what he called the architecture of eternity. He would spend hours in local cemeteries, not mourning the dead, but studying how they were housed. He noticed how cramped and chaotic most burial grounds were, how the dead seemed to be crammed together without thought for their eternal comfort. By the age of 25, Henry had become one of Paris's most sought-after architects. But he refused all commissions for homes, hotels, or public buildings. He would only design for the dead: mausoleums, crypts, cemetery chapels, elaborate tombs for the wealthy. These were his specialties. His designs were breathtakingly beautiful, but also deeply unsettling. They seemed to invite the living to linger, to contemplate not just death, but what came after. Henry's colleagues began to worry when he started speaking about the dead as if they were his clients. He would hold meetings with empty chairs, claiming he was consulting with the deceased about their preferences for their eternal homes. He insisted that the dead had opinions about architecture, about the placement of windows to let in moonlight, about the acoustics of their chambers so they could hear the whispers of the living who came to visit. But Henry's true obsession began in 1895, when his younger sister, Marie, died suddenly of tuberculosis. He was present when she took her final breath, and he later claimed that in that moment, she had whispered to him the secrets of what the dead truly wanted. Whether this was grief-induced hallucination or something more sinister, it changed Henry. Forever, he used his considerable savings and inheritance to purchase nearly 200 acres of rolling hills outside the small town of Sainte Marguerite in southern France. Local authorities initially assumed he was planning a traditional cemetery. But Henry's vision was far more ambitious and far more disturbing. He wasn't building a cemetery, he was building a city. For the next 23 years, Henry Beaumont worked obsessively on his creation. He hired hundreds of workers, but they rarely stayed long. They complained of strange dreams, of hearing voices calling their names from empty buildings under construction. They spoke of finding Henry in the middle of the night, walking the unfinished streets, carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions. The city that slowly took shape was like nothing ever seen before. Henry called it Necropolis. It had wide boulevards lined with elaborate mausoleums designed to look like elegant townhouses. There were public squares with fountains that would never flow, parks with benches facing empty stages where no performances would ever occur. There was even a grand cathedral at the center, its spires reaching toward heaven, but its doors would never open for Sunday service. Every building in the city was a tomb, but they were disguised as the architecture of the living. The baker's shop was actually a crypt for 37 bodies, arranged on shelves behind what looked like bread displays. The library was a repository for the dead, with bodies stored where books would normally rest. The town hall was a massive mausoleum for what Henry called the distinguished deceased. But the most disturbing aspect of Necropolis Eterna was how perfectly it mimicked a living city. Henry installed gas streetlights that would burn eternal flames. He created market stalls that would forever display stone fruits and marble vegetables. He even designed a theater where the dead could eternally watch empty stages. Local workers reported increasingly bizarre incidents as the construction continued. They claimed to see lights moving through completed buildings at night, though no one was supposed to be inside. They heard the sound of carriages on cobblestone streets, but when they investigated, the streets were empty. Some swore they could smell cooking food coming from the stone kitchens of the dead. Henry himself was changing. He grew gaunt and pale, spending more and more time in his creation and less time among the living. He started dressing in black exclusively and began carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. When questioned, he would insist that the residents of his city were very real. They were simply between states and would soon be moving in permanently. The architect hired undertakers from across Europe to begin filling his city with the dead. He purchased unclaimed bodies from hospitals, bought out entire paupers' graves, and even convinced wealthy families to relocate their deceased loved ones to his elaborate necropolis. By 1915, Necropolis Eterna housed over 3,000 bodies, each one placed in buildings designed to reflect how they had lived, or how Henry imagined they should spend eternity. But Henry wasn't finished. The most disturbing discovery came when workers began construction on what was supposed to be Henry's own residence in the city. They found that he had designed not a house, but a mausoleum. A beautiful, elaborate mausoleum with living quarters built directly above the burial chamber. He was planning to live with his own corpse. The local townspeople of Sainte Marguerite had grown increasingly uncomfortable with their strange neighbor. Children were forbidden from playing near the hills where the city of the dead was taking shape. Strange sounds echoed down to the town at night: the tolling of bells, the sound of funeral dirges played by invisible orchestras, and most disturbing of all, what sounded like conversation and laughter coming from a city that should have been silent as the grave. On March 15, 1918, Henry Beaumont put the finishing touches on his masterpiece. The last streetlight was lit, the final tomb was sealed, and Necropolis Eterna was complete. That very night, Henry Beaumont disappeared. The workers found his clothes neatly folded on his desk in the temporary office he had maintained during construction. His personal effects were arranged as if for a funeral display, but Henry himself was nowhere to be found. A search of the entire necropolis revealed no trace of the architect who had devoted his life to building it. But the strangest discovery was yet to come. Local authorities who investigated the disappearance reported an impossible phenomenon. Throughout the city of the dead, they found evidence of a single shadow moving through the streets. Not a person, but a shadow itself. It would appear on walls, on cobblestones, cast by no visible form. The shadow was always alone, always moving, purposefully, as if it had somewhere important to be. Over the following months, visitors to Necropolis Eterna reported increasingly disturbing encounters with this shadow. It would appear beside their own shadows, walking alongside them as they toured the city. Some claimed they could hear it speaking, offering guided tours of the necropolis, explaining the architectural details with Henry's distinctive voice. But when they turned to see who was speaking, there was no one there. Only the shadow, cast by nothing, moving independently across the stone streets. The townspeople of Sainte Marguerite began to speak in whispers about their vanished neighbor. They claimed that Henry had been so obsessed with death, so devoted to serving the dead, that he had somehow become trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Neither fully alive nor fully deceased, he existed as only a shadow, eternally walking the streets of the city he had created. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is what happened to Necropolis Eterna itself. The city continued to function in its own impossible way. The eternal flames in the streetlights never went out, despite no one tending them. The stone flowers in the gardens seemed to grow and change with the seasons. Visitors reported hearing music from the theater district, seeing lights move through the windows of the tomb houses, and most unsettling of all, sensing that they were being watched by invisible residents who had finally moved into their eternal Home's local authorities eventually sealed off Necropolis Eterna, declaring it unsafe for public visitation. But the seal was purely symbolic. The city of the dead had no gates, no walls. Henry had designed it to be completely open, welcoming to all who wished to visit. And visit they did. Despite official warnings, people continued to make pilgrimages to Henry's creation. Most came looking for the shadow of the architect, hoping to glimpse the man who had become so obsessed with death that he had apparently joined his eternal residence. Many claimed to find him, or at least his shadow, still offering tours of his masterpiece, still explaining with pride how he had created the perfect city for those who had passed on. But some visitors to Necropolis Eterna never returned. Their shadows, however, were often seen in the weeks that followed, walking alongside Henry's shadow through the streets of the Eternal City. Today, Necropolis Eterna still stands in the hills above Sainte Marguerite, though few dare to speak of it openly. The French government has never officially acknowledged its existence, perhaps because they cannot explain what Henry Beaumont created there, or what he became in the process. Local guides will tell you, if you ask the right questions and offer the right price, that on clear nights when the moon is dark, you can still see lights moving through the windows of the city of the dead. They'll tell you that Henry Beaumont achieved something that no architect before or since has managed. He created a place where the living and the dead could coexist, where the barrier between life and death became meaningless. But they'll also warn you that Henry's city comes with a price. Those who visit Necropolis Eterna, those who walk its perfectly designed streets and admire its impossible architecture, sometimes find that they've left more than just footprints behind. They discover that their shadows have chosen to remain in the city of the dead, to join Henry Beaumont and the growing population of shadow residents who have found their eternal home in his architectural masterpiece. The question that remains is whether Henry Beaumont was a brilliant architect who lost his mind to obsession, or whether he was something far more disturbing, a man who discovered the secret of bridging the gap between life and death, and chose to become the eternal mayor of a city that exists in both worlds simultaneously. One thing is certain: in the hills of southern France, there is a place where the dead live in perfect architectural harmony, watched over by the shadow of the man who loved them so much that he chose to join them forever. And if you're brave enough to visit Necropolis Eterna, you might find that Henry Beaumont is still there, still offering tours of his creation, still explaining with the passion of a true artist how he built the perfect city for those who have all the time in the world to appreciate it. But remember, in a city designed for the dead, the line between visitor and resident is thinner than you might think, and Henry's shadow is always looking for new neighbors who truly appreciate fine architecture. The dead, after all, make the very best residents. They're quiet, they pay their rent eternally, and they never ever complain about the accommodations.